Tell me, why did you decide to create your own edition of Daphnis?
Good question. Well, I had heard so many stories about the mistakes in the old parts. I remember somebody at the National Youth Orchestra said there were 700 mistakes in the woodwind parts, and then stories from players who just kept changing things because they felt more comfortable making changes in the parts. And I knew that at some point, because we were recording lots of Ravel, I knew that Daphnis would be on the menu. And when the lockdown came and we couldn't leave the house, we couldn't do anything, couldn't work, I wanted to use my time productively, and so I would never again get the chance to sit for 10 hours every day, 12 hours a day, making an edition of a piece this big and this complicated. And it took me many, many months to do, but it was interesting and absorbing work. And you very kindly told me where the manuscript was. I got sent a PDF of the manuscript from the university in America. I had the Durand score, I had the Durand parts, I had piano parts, piano reduction. So they were the sources that I used to create what I think is a practical performing edition. I don't make any claims for this to be like super haut text, but I wanted to create something which was practical, accurate, and most importantly for a piece this complicated, easy to read, so that the players had parts which were really crisp and clean, and the divisi is on separate lines, and because this piece is about divisi, it's the most divided strings piece ever written. So, and many months later, about 18 months later, here we are, and everything is ready.
You you mentioned the manuscripts, and this amazing manuscript located in the States.
That's right.
At the Harry Ransom Center,
yes, that's correct,
Texas. Yeah. And I think now you can understand my day when I try to decipher Ravel's writing. And what do you think about this? Because I remember when you get this manuscript, you rushed to open to read, and you was very surprised.
Yes, because we think of Ravel as being the most meticulous composer of all. And that is true to a certain extent. I mean, if you look at Ravel's music for orchestra, it's extremely polished and it's extremely finished. But I was surprised to find just how wild some of the manuscript was. Just how careless, even in some instances, Ravel had been. So the manuscript to me, whilst being an absolutely fascinating document, only answered some of my questions. And what was, for me, the most interesting thing to do was to compare the manuscript to the Durand engraved score. And I have to say, I think we should make an acknowledgement of the engravers at Durand in the early part of the 20th century, because these were extraordinary craftsmen. To think of the skill that goes into producing those plates for a work like Daphnis, which is 200 pages of incredibly complicated music. And I suspect that Ravel was very closely involved in discussions between the engravers, because the differences between the manuscript and the engraved plates are really considerable. But then, of course, I found that the biggest differences were between the engraved score and the engraved parts, and I think my feeling is that the engraved parts must have been engraved from parts. So that I found that the bulk of my work was trying to make intelligent, rational decisions about, is the score right, are the parts right? And in most instances, the score is the Bible, but in some instances there are changes to the parts which I feel must have been made in the first performance with Monteur, and I think they were not carried into the score. They were not carried over into the score because they were just made on the hoof, in the rehearsal. And so there are quite a few instances where I've transferred information from the parts to the parts. If I felt generally something was missing, but it was in the parts, I've included it just to give the fullest picture possible of Ravel's intentions and to be practical as well.
So what to do with the wrong notes, the misprints from Ravel, from his own writing, and do you accept to cross the boundaries, to correct the composer or to change some chords? What to do?
It's not my job to change notes which Ravel has written if they are verified in multiple sources. So if they're in the piano score, if they're in the engraved score, if they're in the parts, if they're in manuscripts, and if they sound reasonable. If they are clearly wrong, and there are some instances where it's just a mistake, I have changed them, and I have no qualms about doing that. And we have anecdotes from players who worked with Ravel who said that what note would you like in the flute solo, the famous flute solo, the scale, and he was like, oh, play whatever you like. I don't know if that's apocryphal, but that's the tale that we have. He wasn't overly concerned. I don't know if I accept that, but there are some questions to which we will never have the answer. There's a place in the first dance in 7/4 where the timpani has a C natural, everybody else, the cellos, the basses have a C flat, the bassoons have a C flat, and the tradition is largely to play the C natural, although that's never clearly notated. And I've carried that tradition forward because I firmly believe that it's right. Now that's an instance when I've made a decision which most editors wouldn't. They wouldn't agree with me. They probably think I've made a decision I shouldn't have. But I'm not making claims for this edition to be the absolute last word. I'm making a useful, practical edition that will be better for orchestras. And I just had a violin player who's in the BBC Symphony Orchestra, and she just came up to me and she said, "Oh, it's such a joy to play this piece without having to use all my brain to work out what I'm reading." So that's what my desire is, to give the players beautiful parts that they don't have to waste part of their brain working out what the notes are.
Some corrections are very, very personal because so we know we exchange. We know the Pierre Boulez correction.
I think they're very good.
Coming maybe from Olivier Messiaen. So we know Messiaen wrote a lot, of course, with his course of analysis at the Paris Conservatoire. And so Messiaen said that some chords are wrong. So, of course, it's coming, Messiaen was not conductor, Pierre Boulez was a conductor. So he could try, he could make some during the session, he could change an accidental, something like this. Not Olivier Messiaen, but when George Benjamin is coming. And I like George because George is a sort between the two worlds.
Yeah,
and
sure.
You know that George Benjamin absolutely disagrees with some Boulez correction or Messiaen correction.
I have the 2-page list of Boulez errata, and I didn't find very many of them contentious, I have to say. They seemed mainly all to make sense. I didn't change any pitches, any notes, but some dynamics and articulations of Boulez, I think, make sense. So I remember incorporating. Of course, the list of final alteration ran to so many thousands that I can't remember anything but the big decisions. There are, of course, things in the manuscript which I've carried forward, which are optional. Things like extra percussion, which Ravel doesn't seem to have carried forward into the engraved version of the score, but I rather like them, so they are there, and the conductor doesn't have to play them. They can be omitted if desired. So we'll see. What we'll also have at the end of this is a recording for Chandos, and that will be the final stage of this long journey for this piece, and then people can listen to it and make their own minds up.
Let's leave the grammar course and discussion about rhetorical, and maybe something more about the general mood of Daphnis. Do you think it's a French ballet or Russian ballet, or a mix between the two? It's sort of hybrid inspiration for Ravel?
I think it's Ravel's great symphony. You know, he didn't write a symphony, but we have...
You know, it was written symphony. Yeah, the first nickname of the work, Ravel considered it was a symphony.
Well, there you are. I didn't know that, but I do now. So I've always thought of it as being his great symphony. And it's French through and through. It has all of those Russian influences, particularly towards the end when we get glimpses of Scheherazade and Rimsky-Korsakov. But in terms of purely orchestral music, I think it might occupy the place of the sort of possibly the most beautifully crafted creation in all of orchestral music. I can't think of a work more richly complex and elaborate, and it's such a joy to play it. And you look around and you see everybody here realizing that they've got a sort of supreme masterpiece on their stands.
Maybe we could talk about the Chandos sound, because Chandos is doing something very special for you, and something we know this label, of course, for orchestral recordings, very spectacular. But it's not only spectacular. I mean that when we are looking at the setting of the orchestra, it's not a huge orchestra. Finally, it looks like maybe a pit, an opera pit, because it's a bit closed. Desk from desk, and so you've got a very special option, and the staff working with you has got some very precise ideas about, of course, the Ravel sound.
I think for me to work with Chandos and Ravel is a particularly ideal combination, because Ralph, who runs Chandos, who is the engineer in these projects, has spent 40 years honing his craft. I don't know if he really knows how he does it, but he has a bit of a magical touch when it comes to capturing what really happens in the room. And we stay in this room in particular. So we've been making records here now for 3 or 4 years, and with each record that comes along, I think Ralph and the players have a greater affinity with the room, and they get to know the room better. So I think there's been an increasing sort of clarity and focus in the sound. I wouldn't want to record this piece, which is so elaborate, It's using every channel on the desk, on the recording desk, in any other building or with any other engineer or with, any other setup. The setup is absolutely, I think, I hope, ideal.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to talk to you. Thank you, François.
Merci.